He wanted people in the future to see how much he loved her and to know that he wasn't wrong for loving her the way he did. He was with her when she died. There is no way he left her body to disappear.
This is Tante Belle Cose, a podcast where we'll explore the many beautiful things that Italy has to offer. In each episode, we'll dive into unique stories to inspire your future travels. And I'll share expert travel advice, as well as introduce you to the people that make Italy so special. I'm your host, Danielle O'Terry. I'm a writer, art historian, and the founder of Feast Travel, Arthur Avenue Food Tours, and Cilento Food Tours. Andiamo. If you liked Raiders of the Lost Ark, Lara Croft Tomb Raider, or The Mummy, well, have I got a story for you today. This episode visits two of my favorite places. The first is Naples, specifically the Historic Center, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. And then we'll take the ferry out to Ischia. It's part of an archipelago, volcanic, and famous for its hot springs. Tourists go there for vacations and spa treatments that utilize the healing properties of the volcanic soil and mineral water. We'll also run into Michelangelo in this episode. And most importantly, we'll meet the woman who was the love of his life. So let's start at the beginning. Starting in 1442, Naples was ruled by a dynasty from Spain that we're going to refer to as the Aragonese kings of Naples. Alfonso V of Aragon was the subject of my master's thesis, and so I'm kind of in love with the guy. And I spent 2 years studying and writing about the art and architecture he commissioned when he transformed Naples into an important Renaissance city. And I spent so much time thinking about his life that I never thought that much about his death until I visited the Church of San Domenico in Naples, which you should too. It's a Gothic church that has been considered the most important church in Naples for centuries. And inside the sacristy are entombed all of the Aragonese kings and queens. They are all laid to rest in arks, which is another word for the coffin or the container in which they are kept. And this is where the story gets really interesting. On November 21st, 1980, an earthquake rocked Naples, and the arks were disrupted. And during the cleanup, it was discovered that the warm breeze that wafts off the Bay of Naples through a small window in the sacristy had naturally mummified the bodies. And this was an incredible and rare opportunity for paleopathologists. They could now study these bodies of the most elite citizens of their day, literally tap into their flesh and bones to understand their health and diet and their lives. The bodies were removed from the arks and closely investigated and cataloged by historians. Then in 1985, the mummies were transferred to laboratories at the University of Pisa. Years of research revealed that these royals had many predictable ailments like gout and syphilis. One person had a fatal stab wound, and another a colorectal tumor caused by eating too much red meat. And they found the first recorded case of HPV, dating the virus back 200 more years than before it was ever thought to have existed. And here is where things take a turn. In the Ark, next to Ferrante Davalos, a military captain who died fighting in northern Italy, there was something that didn't make sense. The Ark had a label on it that identified it as holding a viceroy of Sicily, but the body inside was wearing a nun's gown, and then underneath the gown was the clothing of a noblewoman, and it was still on a stretcher, indicating that it had been moved in a hurry. And then when scientists began investigating the body, the flesh and the bones, an even bigger mystery was revealed. Textile conservators preserved the clothes and eventually returned them to San Domenico. So after you visit the sacristy, where the arks are kept, you can move deeper into the next room. And there you'll find enormous wooden wardrobes, themselves hundreds of years old. And you're encouraged to open the drawers because inside, all of the clothes that those mummies wore are preserved beneath glass. And you can just put your nose right up to them. It was even more thrilling when I opened the drawer that held the clothes of Ferrante Davalos, and I snapped a photo and I sent it to my friend, Rita J. King, because she's actually maybe related to this guy. Her great-grandfather is from Ischia, where Davalos was born and raised, and the family name, Ferrandino, indicates that she may be one of his descendants. Now, Davalos was married to Vittoria Colonna, a princess from the Papal States, but the couple never had children. Yet local legend says that Ferrante was very popular among the women of Ischia and had many illegitimate children. Hence, Ferrandino means one of the little Ferrantes.
In 2013, I made my first trip to Ischia, and it was spectacular. Ischia was presented to me as this island where our ancestors packed volcanic mud onto tourists. And all I knew is that there were giant lemons. That was it. There was nothing else. Papi Joe, my great-grandfather, he was from Ischia. That's all I knew. Everybody left Naples and the surrounding islands to come to New York. Both sets of my great-grandparents met in Brooklyn, and I didn't know anything. But I always pined to go to Ischia, even though I didn't have much information. Just intuitively, I knew it was this exotic volcanic island, and I wanted to see it. I never went until I was an adult. So it was like an imaginary friend that sat in the back of my mind and refused to play with me. I arrived at the hotel, and the concierge asked me what brought me there. And I told him I was there to get my great-grandfather's birth certificate. He asked me my great-grandfather's name, and I told him, Giuseppe Ferrandino. He raised his dark, angular eyebrow in a very familiar way and told me that his name was Vincenzo Ferrandino. The woman working next to him told me that her mother's name was Ferrandino. It turns out that the port of Ischia is like the film Being John Malkovich, except instead of Malkovich, it's Ferrandino. Vincenzo asked me how much I knew about our family history, and I told him the truth. I did not know anything. He looked at me, and he took a pen out of his pocket and circled on the hotel map a location. And then he ripped the paper map off and handed it to me and said, "Go learn." And that is what I have been doing for the past 10 years. Before I walked away, I asked them what it is about our family I was there to learn. And she put her hand over her heart and said, "That poor woman." And I didn't know who this woman was, or why that poor woman, or how she connected to me. But I knew right away that there was some sort of ghost I was there to meet and learn about.
The man at the hotel had sent Rita to the castle of Ischia. It's close to the port where all of the ferries arrive, and it looks just like a rock in the sea, but with a village on top. It's so striking. And though the island has been inhabited since the 5th century BCE, this rock really flourished as a community during the Aragonese period in the late 1400s and early to mid 1500s. And during that time, there are recorded as many as 1,800 people living on top of this one rock in a walled village, including Ferrante Davalos and his wife, Vittoria Colonna. Vittoria, in particular, lived there for 35 years, and she was the leader of an important intellectual circle there. This village on a rock fell into a long period of decline, and eventually in the 19th century it was abandoned. Then in 1912, a local lawyer purchased it from the government, and he moved onto the rock and slowly began restoring it with his own hands. Today it's maintained by his grandchildren, and they could easily turn it into a luxury hotel, but instead, they work to keep this essential piece of Ischia's history alive. So if you visit, you must go to the castle. There's a small entrance fee that goes toward maintaining the rock, and lots of art programs and installations and events that help animate the past.
I met the owner, Nicola Matera, and he explained to me the history of this rock and the people who once lived on it. I followed him to this beautiful sunlit space, and it had been converted into a small gift shop. Next to the register, there was a book propped up, and on the cover of that book, a woman's face is painted, and her eyes pierced me from 5 centuries earlier. She was sent to the rock as a blood oath at the age of 4 or 5, committed in a future marriage to a boy who also grew up on the rock, Ferrante Davalos. I quickly realized I was much more interested in the wife of my ancestor than I was in my ancestor. She was childless, and that is why she was that poor woman. Why was she childless is a big part of the mystery of this story, because he apparently impregnated chambermaids and other women. We also know that Ferrante Davalos, who had grown up with her, fled their wedding night in some sort of terror or surprise. Something upset him to the point where he fled. And he made a public show out of his infidelities to her, even though she was one of the most respected princesses of the era.
Vittoria Colonna is the one woman you find in textbooks who held status among the Renaissance elite. And after she was widowed, she wanted to become a nun, but she couldn't because of a long-standing beef between the Pope and her family. And to give you some idea of what I mean by beef, Machiavelli wrote The Art of War about her father. So she dressed as a secular nun and devoted her life to poetry and spirituality.
All of the top intellectuals of her time publicly acknowledged their perception that she had male brains, which seems very unusual given the fact that women were not permitted to speak in the public sphere, much less on intellectual topics. Women weren't even allowed to express emotion in the public sphere. Yet, she was the first person who ever had a book of her own poems published under her own name. And she was a top advisor to emperors, kings, queens, princes, popes. People took her seriously, and they attributed this to her male brains. She was the oldest child. She had many brothers behind her, yet she was the one who became a war advisor and a strategic commander behind the scenes, of course. She also could not inherit her family land because she was a woman, but she did run it. She ran engineering projects. She helped administer and determine justice in their many towns. So she was entrusted with many responsibilities that were reserved only for men. And Michelangelo was obsessed with her.
Vittoria Colonna is most famous for having been a muse and a mentor to Michelangelo. In the 19th century, it was speculated that they were lovers, but that reflected Victorian values much more than the official record. He wrote lots of romantic poems to another man. Vittoria and Michelangelo wrote letters and poems to each other and enjoyed a very deep friendship based on the admiration and absolute awe that Michelangelo held for her.
The record shows an official first meeting dating back to the 1530s, after Vittoria was a widow and Michelangelo returned to Rome after working in Florence for so many years. She was at the peak of her literary fame when they met. She was a noble. He was conditioned by his father to believe that God had a plan for him, and his plan was to restore the lost family fortune. And in fact, he died very wealthy. And he had a tendency to gravitate toward people who were very powerful. So each of them, they were the only two people of their time, both known as divine. When he was not around her, he became sullen and angry and withdrawn. And there were times when she was ill and didn't want to correspond, and he would get very upset. He would stop working. He would come to her and demand an explanation. He needed her more than she needed him. She needed him to visualize her radical ideas. And she cared very much about him, but he was obsessed with her. And her intellect and her spiritual power shaped his spirituality in ways that art history has not properly reflected.
These were dark and difficult years in Rome. The Protestant Reformation brought about the Counter-Reformation, and Vittoria and Michelangelo were part of a group that believed in reform, and that reform had to come from within the church. And they were very involved with sharing their spiritual ideas and beliefs. But the tense atmosphere led to the Roman Inquisition, and Vittoria's poetry was scrutinized for heresy. She fell ill just as the threat loomed most large, and she died in a convent, surrounded by nuns. And after her body was placed in a coffin, it disappeared. To this day, nobody knows what happened to it.
She died in 1547, and he went on to live for many more years, though he said he was a spent coal after she died. He was devastated. And he also states that he was with her at the time of her death. Vittoria died after an illness. She had problems with her lungs when she was traveling in the north, and something serious happened that required her to become almost completely convalescent at the convent. And that was for about 2 years. She took away his fear. She carved him like a stone. She chipped away the parts that were not his soul and left him sparkling, fresh, deeply connected to himself and his goals and his spirituality. And when he could not interact with her, he was desolate. So when she died, after a period of sickness at the convent in Rome, he was there. He regretted not kissing her face, he said. He only kissed her hand when she died. But that tells us that he was there. And yet, then her body disappeared, left in the pitch coffin by the nuns who knew she was suspected of heresy. There is no way Michelangelo would have allowed Vittoria Colonna's body to simply disappear.
Now return with me to San Domenico and the Ark next to Ferrante d'Avalos. Remember the one that was supposed to hold a viceroy of Sicily? But instead, the mummy inside was wearing a nun's gown, and then a noblewoman's gown beneath that. And it looks exactly like the dress in a portrait of Vittoria Colonna. And several of the historians who first investigated the body, when it was removed from the Ark in 1980, believed the body was hers. Upon Vittoria's death in Rome, her brother Ascanio was in prison in Naples, and he could have arranged to have her body sneaked out of Rome, where the Inquisition was on her heels, and have her laid to rest next to her beloved husband, Ferrante d'Avalos. This would have had to have been done quickly and in secret, which also explains the stretcher. But that's only the beginning. When the body was examined, scientists couldn't determine if it was male or female. The skull indicated that it was male, but the wide hips, the very long fingers and feet, which showed evidence of a life wearing heeled shoes, all indicated female. The body had been embalmed before burial, as seen through 2 long incisions that were made with skill, and the lungs had been removed. It was the pelvis that was confusing. This person, if female, was certainly a virgin because there's no way she could have been penetrated. During the Renaissance, somebody with this type of body would have been called a hermaphrodite. Today, the correct term is intersex, and it describes a person born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit the typical definitions of male or female.
One of the fascinating things about studying history is how you have to piece together visuals in your mind from writings and paintings and drawings. And so looking at what's known about her, the thing that strikes you most is the description of her as having male brains. What does that mean exactly? She had her father's brains. She was a war advisor. She advised popes and kings and dukes and princes and queens. But is that what they meant by male brains? I don't think so, because women weren't really permitted at all to contribute to the public sphere. So to describe a woman so consistently as saying that she has male brains is an honor that would be conferred upon who? Only her. I've never seen that before in history, that a woman was described by her contemporaries so often as having male brains, including she asked the Pope once for permission to travel by herself to the Holy Land, and permission was granted on account of her having male brains, proving herself to have male characteristics. I've read descriptions of her being so much taller than her husband that he would enter rooms before her to create the appearance of them being closer in height from a distance. So she was physically strong. When they were kids, she used to beat him in equestrian competitions. And in fact, she was told she was no longer allowed to compete against him. And her response was, well, if he can't beat me, how is he going to win in a war? His dream was to be the supreme commander. So there are many references to her physical strength, her courage, her male brains, her androgynous characteristics. Her face is described as androgynous in several writings. Michelangelo responded to the androgyny in her. Paolo Giovio said God was in a cocky mood when he created Vittoria Colonna.
What did he mean by that? What do you think that means?
I think it's a combination. Again, she had a lot of physical swagger. She had command of a space. She was elegant in herself. She was self-possessed. Despite her emotional turmoil, which is well documented by her in her own writings and poems, outwardly, she was always incredibly composed, incredibly elegant, Spartan in her presentation of herself. And he described even the shape of her nose, the bump in her nose that seemed more male than female, yet did not diminish her femininity in any way. But he felt compelled to point out that her nose seemed androgynous to him. So again, there are references to this androgyny in her look. There's even a reference to the fact that she developed her mind to compensate for her lack of beauty. And there's other accounts of her being wildly beautiful. In fact, Michelangelo said he wanted to become one eye so that he could just do nothing but perceive her, and that all other beauties turned to death in his mind because of her extreme beauty. So beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
It is fascinating to think about Vittoria Colonna with this unique body during the Renaissance, a time when gender was more fluid than you might think. Angelology was known to most learned people, and the Order of Angels was studied at important universities. And angels were the beings closest to God. And as these figures between humans and God, they were considered genderless. Don't believe me? Look at any medieval or Renaissance painting and observe the angels. They're always floating in between humans and God, playing instruments, delivering messages with scrolls, and generally having a good time. And they wear clothes and hairstyles that make them indistinguishable as either male or female. It was during the Renaissance in particular that it was written that the feminine male and the manly female are graceful in almost every aspect, which is to say, the most attractive state for men and women was androgyny. Michelangelo is famous for these very muscular and masculine figures of women, especially in the Sistine Chapel frescoes. Now, some scholars have written this off as his lack of interest in the female form because he was homosexual. But a better place to seek an explanation is in the ideas that were being studied in the circles in which Vittoria Colonna and Michelangelo circulated. They were reading very ancient ideas that were renewed during the Renaissance, because Renaissance means rebirth. And Platonism and Kabbalah were two of the philosophies that they studied, where the idea of androgyny was considered divine. And there's a lot of scholarly discussion about how these ideas manifested in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But what I want to highlight for this particular conversation is that these philosophies envisioned a God that didn't have a gender. So, Rita, after 10 years of you thinking about her, writing about Vittoria Colonna and, imagining different scenarios, her as a kid, what she looked like as a widow, her on her deathbed. What was it like when I sent you that article that had the picture of the mummy that may, very well indeed be her? What did you think when you first saw it?
I was so staggered by your discovery of this mummy. I myself have been to the church where I thought only her husband and the kings of Naples were stored in their coffins. But she was there too, if in fact this is her mummy, which I feel very strongly that it likely is. Just the tapered fingers alone look like the painting of her done by Sebastiano del Piombo, and she is wearing also, that mummy is wearing an outfit that looks like that painting of her, then with a nun's habit over it. And after she became a widow, she became a secular nun. She wasn't allowed to take the veil, but she dressed like a nun and acted like a nun. And it was her public persona that she was, chastity. And she was married to the same man in death forever, which prevented her from having to get remarried and also gave her the opportunity to grow her literary fame. So I was staggered by the mummy, and I've looked at the picture of the mummy. I- Seeing a mummy is stunning, especially one from 5 centuries ago, from the period that I've been studying for a decade now. It really spoke to me across time.
I mean, I remember when I went to San Domenico for the first time and saw their clothes. It was such a moment of like, wow, these were actually real people. And, we know this intellectually, right? But there was something about seeing their clothes and how little they all were, how tiny they were, that was just mind blowing.
There's found it absolutely stunning to see the tiny clothes in the drawers. They're under glass. They're yellowed by time, but they are finely made garments that look like they could fit on a second grader. And these people were adult. They were tiny. And it also made me realize how much physical command Ferrante Davalos had, that he was this small man who was this brave warrior, and he was a hothead, and he was famous for being a hothead. And there's his clothes in this little drawer. I mean, it's the ultimate memento mori. You see these tiny clothes in a drawer. You see these mummies. You see these coffins lined up in this church, and all time collapses. It's an incredibly spiritual experience. And after years of intellectual inquiry about these people, reading letters, reading poems, interviewing people, reading books, finding documents, traveling back and forth to Italy, there's something so visceral about the tiny clothes and the mummies.
When I read that first pathologist's report, and there's the syphilis and the gout and the HPV, I mean, so many venereal diseases, it was like looking behind the curtain at these, the most elite citizens of their time, and they had access to the most money, to the best quality food, to servants to do anything and everything for them. But they still had human bodies, and they were susceptible to all of the same diseases as anybody else.
What you say is also true of Michelangelo. From the perspective of history, he's this titan. He's still famous. We talk about him and we know his work, and he was this powerful, also very small person. He suffered from kidney stones. And I remember when I first read that, the irony of this giant who carves these sculptures that we're still talking about today, afflicted within himself by a kidney stone.
Was that why he was so cranky? I mean, because those are very painful.
It is partly why he was so cranky, and he had to drink special water. I mean, who knows what the water even did.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it is part of the reason he was cranky. He was physically in pain.
When you think about how they would have experienced their own bodies, it must have been so much more intense. We're so fortunate today, right? You go to the drugstore and get an over the counter pill for something that would have killed people 100 years ago.
Think about Ferrante Davalos. His dream in life and his single-minded purpose and goal was to become the supreme commander of the Emperor Charles V, whose nickname was the North Wind because he was so cold. He had severe hemorrhoids. He was in agonizing pain all the time. This guy's riding his horse around in his empire, and the guy's got hemorrhoids, right? These are people.
And that'll put you in a really rotten mood.
He wasn't happy. I leave a lot of space for the fact that I don't know everything. I only know what I've studied and felt. And something has always been missing from this story. I mean, she was treated like a woman who was a man. So I think there's a lot of evidence to support the idea that people may have known something was different about her. There's no ambiguity that she was perceived as a woman and treated like a woman in her lifetime. But she was treated and perceived as a woman who was taken as seriously as a man in many ways, in addition to her physicality. There was a characteristic about her that was so yin and yang that just kept attracting me over and over again. Her spirituality was so complex and nuanced and highly developed. She was very involved with the religious reform movement and an extremely sophisticated thinker, but she's incredibly analytical, and her curiosity and her intellect were always at war with her spirituality and her emotion. And it was as if the stereotypical female side of herself and the stereotypical male side of herself battled out for dominance in her between her analytical side and her spiritual side. So it was not immediately obvious to me that these were related to sex or her being intersex. But after you sent me that pathology report and I read about the mummy they found, it just all clicked into place for me.
So, would Michelangelo have known how to embalm her?
Yes, Michelangelo would have known how to embalm her. So a little discussed fact about his life is that he lived at the court of the Medici from the age of 15 to 17. This is where he produced his first works. They were ousted from Florence, and for 2 years, he went to a church and he dissected bodies. That is how he knows so much about the physical form. And this was not allowed back then, right? So bodies had to be intact for heaven. So for years, he would go to prisoners, and this was even after these initial 2 years. He would go to prisoners before their execution and promise them a proper burial, and they would unburden themselves to him. If they had anything they wanted to get off their chest before execution, they would talk to him. He was a member of a confraternity. He didn't tell them that in between he was going to dissect their bodies, but he did, and then he would give them a proper burial. It is known that he was there when Vittoria Colonna, the great love of his life, died. And it is also known that the nuns left her in this plain pine coffin with pitch tar inside in the entryway to the convent because she was suspected of heresy at that time, and her body disappeared. I promise you, there is no way, zero, that Michelangelo just left her body. Her mind was described as glowing like fires on the pyramids of Egypt seen from great distances, as penetrating regions yet unexplored. Those are incredibly flattering comments about a person's intellect. And for a woman to get those compliments from male contemporaries in a patriarchal society that did not allow women to contribute to the public sphere is almost unthinkable.
And there were many other brilliant women in the Renaissance courts during this time, so it's not as though there was no competition for intelligent females. There were plenty. And yet she still stands out. So it's interesting. I mean, do you think that there was something about her physicality that gave her greater agency?
One thing that has always struck me about her physicality is many of the women of the time who were her brilliant contemporaries, such as Isabella d'Este, are a lot of makeup. The descriptions of the cosmetics being layered on at that time is unbelievable. She didn't. She did not wear a lot of. Now, early in her life, when she was young and she still had to show off her father and husband's wealth in what she chose to wear, she was just as elaborate as the rest of them. But after her parents died and her husband died, she immediately started wearing very plain nun's habit. So part of her physicality came across as plain, which gave her a confidence that most of the women didn't have because they put so much effort into appearing ornate, and that worked against them.
After her husband died, she sort of redesigns herself to remove sex or the prospect or possibility of sex from the equation. And she's not trying to attract another husband. Also, she doesn't have children. She doesn't have to be a mother.
She didn't have children. But she did have her husband's heir who rose to extreme prominence as the right hand of the emperor. She managed to achieve what all of the rest of the women desperately wanted for their own eldest son, to rise to the level of being right next to the emperor during public appearances and fighting his crusades for him. And she did it while being respected for her mind, while becoming the first woman in Italy to have a book of poems published under her own name, while she was dressed plainly, while she was contributing to the public sphere. So Vittoria Colonna had it all.
I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Tante Belle Cose as much as I have. And there is so much more to this story. If you want to learn more, subscribe to Rita's newsletter, which is called Finishing Michelangelo's Work. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. She's laying it all out for you there. Now, if you would like to join our travel community, you can become a subscriber on Substack. This week, we'll talk about Ischia and Naples, and while this podcast will always be free, if you want to get expert advice and talk to other people who are going to these destinations and also make sure that you're actually getting good advice, I am on the other side moderating everything. To become a subscriber, it's just $8 a month. Thank you so much for listening.